Hello, 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 everyone. This is the Earful Tower. I am on paternity leave, taking some time off, while you guys hopefully are enjoying this audio experience from Paris on Air, my memoir. This is Chapter 5. I won't waste your time. Let's get straight into the book, and I hope you enjoy it. Chapter 5. The Earful Tower and a New French President. 5.1. The Radio. 2 years had passed since I moved to Paris, and I was in a slump. The news that I had come to cover was getting me down. There was just so much horror, so much terror. Since I'd been in the Paris office, there'd been the Charlie Hebdo terror attack, the November attacks at the Bataclan, the Bastille Day attack in Nice, plus a spate of other terror-related shootings and stabbings, not to mention the horrific Germanwings plane crash in the French Alps. News, by its very nature, is often bad, and I was realizing that it wasn't giving me the Paris experience I'd been hoping for. But it wasn't just that. Working in a small team in a startup meant a lot of work and not a lot of exploring Paris. Being at the desk from 9 to 6, Monday to Friday, meant I never really had my finger on the pulse of the city for anything besides its news. I didn't know how busy a Paris cafe was at 2 p.m. on a Wednesday. I didn't know when the garbage men typically came down my street. I didn't know whether the metro was busy outside peak hour on a weekday. It was around this point that we had a young intern at the news site, James, who was flat broke and looking for opportunities. He'd been with us a while and was eager to find a full-time gig. One day, while scrolling around online, I saw a job as a junior producer on a radio station called World Radio Paris. I sent him the link, he applied for the job, and got it. Not long down the line, he got back in touch with me. "Ollie, mate, if you're interested in hosting a radio show, I've got a volunteer spot for you," he said. "Have a think about it, and if it's something for you, come along to meet the other volunteers at the studio. Come and discover the truth." The truth, huh? Bit strange, I thought. I did indeed consider it, but my instinct was telling me that it wasn't for me. I'd always been interested in radio, but this was sounding like more work, more news, more grim reporting. Many, if not most reporters out there were far more invested in journalism than I was, far more talented at it, and far more serious, living and breathing the news and discussing it outside of office hours. Not me. I enjoyed the news, but I didn't devour it in the way that other journalists did. This made me hesitant to take on more reporting at the radio. I should stress that my time at the news site was hugely memorable and important for me. While the editor may have been disappointed in my taste for raw bacon and the fact that I never got a French girlfriend, he was instrumental in teaching me so much of what I know about reporting. But not just that, he's the one who taught me what's important in France, which stories matter, what the readers care for, and why they care. He gave me the context I so sorely lacked when I had moved to France 2 years earlier, and he was an expert at looking through a French newspaper and knowing exactly which stories an international audience would want to read. Despite my initial hesitation about the radio, I couldn't shake the idea of at least dipping my toe into that world. Just nothing newsy, nothing too much like work. A kind of talk show, perhaps. A series of interviews with interesting people, talking about Paris. Why not? I texted the idea to James, and he invited me to meet the other volunteers the next week. I listened into the station in the following days and was impressed by the work the others had put in. There were music reviewers, interviews with artists, and people sharing their life stories about Paris. When I went to the meeting, everyone in the room explained their programs and the ideas to the group. They were all volunteers, fun-loving people, making radio shows for the listeners out of the goodness of their hearts. They were a ragtag bunch, carefree, living for the joy of on-air conversation. When it was time to explain my idea, I told them how I wanted to escape the clutches of the news and do a talk show, and they all politely listened. The only thing they stressed was that if I was to join them, then it had to be for a full season. No dipping a toe in, I had to dive in head first. I nodded to show my understanding. After the meeting, James took me aside. He could sense that I was hesitant to sign up as a volunteer, hesitant to commit to something for so long. We sat on 2 large leather armchairs, and there was an unmistakable darkness that crept over the room as he made his pitch. He looked me in the eye. "You're a slave, Oliver, working in a job that is prison for your mind." He explained that I needed to explore community radio, or, as he called it, the truth. Unfortunately, No one can be told what community radio is. You have to see it for yourself. This is your last chance. After this, there is no turning back. Why did this sound so familiar? Where had I heard this? Was he quoting something? Was his accent going a little bit American? He continued, leaning forward so that his leather trench coat creaked against the armchair. You say no. The story ends. You wake up in your bed, and you believe whatever you want to believe. You sign up as a volunteer. You stay in Wonderland, and I show you how deep the rabbit hole goes. Remember, all I'm offering is the truth, nothing more. That's what this was. It was the Matrix, definitely the Matrix. James, who had a penchant for theatrics, was having a Morpheus moment with me, offering me the proverbial blue or red pill to help stress the importance of the decision. Theatrics aside, James was right to take the matter seriously, as it was a choice that would eventually change my life. But I didn't know it at the time. I told him I'd give him my answer in a week. "5.2 The Eiffel Tower." One night after a basketball game in the old Marketplace Sports Hall, I went for a beer with two American musicians, Sam and Aurelian, and they had a band called Slim and the Beast. I told them my idea for a radio show. I told them I had an open offer, but that I was still hesitating, and they didn't tolerate that.
Ollie, you're saying you could do a radio show, you've got an idea, and you've got nothing to lose? What's stopping you exactly?
Asked Sam. I listed a few concerns, and Aurelian looked baffled.
Yo, who cares? Just do it.
Well, what if I can't find guests? What if every week I end up struggling to come up with ideas? Where'd I even start?
Look, Ollie, we'll be your first guests, I'll get the next pint, and we'll bring the guitars.
Sam added.
Yeah, we're not even going to discuss it anymore, dude. When you come to basketball next week, come with the time and a date for episode numero uno.
One thing I admire about Americans is that they believe anything is possible. I've heard that American children grow up hearing they can be president one day, and it instills confidence in them, for better or worse. These two Americans believed in me, and I needed that boost. So just like that, the idea was in place, and I had my first guests. I confirmed my commitment with James, booked my first studio time, and started writing questions for the band. There was just one piece missing, I realized, as my telephone beeped. Ollie, we need a name for your show. It was James, of course, and I had nothing for him. I went for a walk along the Bassin de la Villette during my lunch break at the news site. The Bassin is a big stretch of water that picks up where the Canal Saint-Martin stops off. And as I walked, I thought about my new show. How to sum up a radio show that's meant to be fun, entertaining, light, and crucially, about Paris. I went through the main words associated with the city, as everyone who's ever written a blog, a book, or made a social media account about Paris has done before me. Baguette, croissant, café au lait, vin rouge. Nope, nothing. What about place names? Paris, Arc de Triomphe, Sacré-Cœur? Nothing still. I wandered up on a green iron bridge that crossed the water and saw, way off in the distance, the top floor of the Eiffel Tower. Funny, I thought. I'd been working here for 2 years. I didn't know we had this very view just outside. The Eiffel Tower was in my mind, on the tip of my tongue, and I kept thinking about my show. How could I sum it up? Something to listen to, something to hear, something for your ears. Hang on. Something for your ears. Something about the Eiffel Tower. Yes. Bullseye. The Eiffel Tower. I felt a rush of excitement, and I texted James immediately. The show will be called The Eiffel Tower. And so, my next chapter began. The Eiffel Tower was born. The early days of the Eiffel Tower were carefree and fun. The radio station had no accurate statistics for how many people listened, if anyone at all. I'd asked James to be my sidekick for the show, and as a thanks, I'd bring a bottle of red wine or two into the studio, and we'd fly by the seat of our pants every time. The first ever episode, as agreed with Sam and Aurelian, was with their band. They brought their guitars and harmonicas into the studio, and I was so nervous that I'd planned out the half-hour interview to the minute. Even though I knew the guests, and perhaps because we'd had a glass or two of wine before we started, I felt like I had no idea what I was about to do. I had a list of questions, and James had time cards to let us know how long we'd been talking. and I was nervous. But as soon as we got going that night, the strangest thing happened. I felt a kind of calmness as we pressed record, a serenity. Everything else faded away, and I was truly present in the moment. Sure, I had the questions beside me, but I didn't need them. And sure, James would hold up a time card every 5 minutes, but I didn't really need that either.
Settle me down and drink to my health. Dream of a woman.
You're listening to World Radio Paris. I'm Oliver G for a brand new show called The Earful Tower. I was just thinking, guys, while you got the guitars out, what this show, The Earful Tower, really lacks is a jingle. You guys, first episode lacks a jingle.
Gotta get the jingle.
Do you think you could put together one with the show name and
And your name?
my name as well? I don't know if you can do jingles. It might be beneath you as a
Try a
band,
little.
but while we got the
A little
guitars
bit of pressure, but
All right.
Something jazzy kind of?
Jazzy.
There we go. I got 2-5. A 2-5. 2-5-1.
Eiffel Tower
Yeah.
with yeah, I like that.
Look at these twins.
Okay,
guys.
here we go.
Yeah, let's
Ready?
go.
Let's try to harmonize on the
Eiffel Tower
with Oliver
Yeah.
G. Right? Here we go. 1, 2, 3.
Eiffel Tower with Oliver G.
Whether that first episode was any good or not, you can be the judge. It's still out there, right at the bottom of the list. But something about it just felt right, and I was already craving more. I reached out to a bunch of people I'd interviewed in the past for the news site. I'm amazed looking back that any of them agreed to be on the show. I can only imagine that it was a mix of my persistence, that they knew who I was from my journalist days, and that they were intrigued by radio. But some of those early guests were big names in the Paris expat scene. There was acclaimed pastry chef and writer David Leibovitz, author Stephen Clark, who I'd long admired before I ever moved to France, and then there was the former head of the New York Times Paris bureau, Elaine Chalino. I actually recorded with Elaine in the Shakespeare & Company bookshop after she'd given a talk, which was a wonderful treat in itself. But another fortuitous thing happened that night. I met another author, Australian John Baxter. He'd been giving a talk with Elaine, and I approached him afterwards. We chatted, ever so briefly and ever so forgettably for him, I'm sure. I'd never have predicted that a year down the track we'd have become friends. And I certainly wouldn't have guessed that it'd be after his birthday party that I'd proposed to Lena on a Parisian bridge. But I'm getting ahead of myself again. I was meeting interesting people, and I was loving it. It was fun too, despite the fact that the studio was just a desk in an open-plan office. The radio station had permission to use it after 7 p.m., providing all the office workers had gone home for the day. It wasn't a professional setup, but they had great microphones, and that's all we really needed. The dream, of course, was to have a private studio where we could record at any time of the day, and that was apparently in the pipeline, they said. After a few months of the amateur hour on the radio, James told me that things were sailing smoothly. You know, there's a spike in traffic every time we air one of your shows, he said. There could be something in this. The head of the radio station contacted me to tell me the same thing. What do you know about podcasting? He asked me. Absolutely nothing, I responded. He explained that a podcast was just like a radio show, except subscribers could download it to their phone and enjoy it at their own leisure, rather than, say, every Friday at 8 p.m. like a radio program. It was all new to me, and little did I know that before long I'd be teaching podcasting at a Parisian university, meeting with mayors and wrestling with crocodiles. But there I go again, getting way ahead of the story. .3, the 11th. The hunt for a new apartment ended when a friend left Paris and leased us her apartment in the trendy 11th arrondissement. We ended up staying there for the next 18 months. The apartment was twice as big as the maid's quarters on the 7th floor and half as charming. But our friend didn't need a dossier, just a promise that we'd pay rent. I handed in my notice for our tiny flat and we moved soon after. 2 years in that minuscule place seem ridiculous in retrospect, but I still don't regret it at all. In fact, I still miss it sometimes. But life in the 11th was a whole new Paris. Gone were the tourists, for one thing. And it wasn't as picture-perfect as the 2nd arrondissement. No, sir. But it was interesting in another way. We lived on the Rue de la Fontaine au Roi, King's Fountain Road, which ran from the Canal Saint-Martin all the way up a gently sloping hill into Belleville. The street was named after the fountain that once provided Parisians with water, which ran through aqueducts to the town below. The fountain is long gone now, and the street is perhaps better known nowadays for housing one of the bars that was targeted in the terror attacks. It was no coincidence that those terrorists had chosen the 11th district to attack, because the terraces of the local bars were always full. But it was a pretty fascinating place to live, especially in those days. Gentrification was sweeping up our street like an Australian bushfire and taking everything in its path. We watched it happen right outside our front door. When we moved in, there was an aging internet cafe across the road. Within months, it was replaced by an organic fruit and vegetable shop, then a hipster Asian restaurant. The shops on both sides of it had similar fates. Senegalese restaurants turned into specialty coffee shops. A nearby bar that was once popular with elderly locals turned into the hippest dive bar in the neighborhood. But not everyone was thrilled with the new face of the 11th arrondissement. On the local bistro-turned-dive bar, someone took a black marker pen and scrawled in big English letters on an outside wall, "Hipsters die." Our 18 months in the area included a lot of socializing, particularly around the Canal Saint-Martin, the city's picnicking capital. Our timing was perfect, our neighbors said. The canal area had only recently undergone a facelift that saw hipsters replace drug dealers and cafes in the place of tired shops. As for us, we'd sit on the canal side with a bottle of wine from a nearby supermarket and stay long into the night. If it got cold, we'd wander into one of the nearby bars or restaurants, or we'd migrate gradually uphill to the happy hours of Rue Saint-Maur and beyond. Over the 2 years we'd been in Paris, we'd surrounded ourselves with a good group of friends, and we rarely stayed home when the weather was good. And it wasn't only that we had more friends. We noticed that living on the ground floor made it a whole lot easier to duck out onto the street, for whatever reason. I found myself popping out for ingredients as Lena had developed a keen interest in baking, thanks to the fact that we finally had a real oven after 2 years without one. Lena was baking like a woman possessed, and her cakes and muffins were delicious. And I could just run out and get eggs within 3 minutes. It was wonderful. But the best part of all, we agreed, was finally escaping the 7 flights of stairs with no elevator, which had eventually made it a chore to leave the flat. Back in those early days in the 11th, I remember we once sat down over a fresh banana cake, Lena's new specialty, to toast to the new lives ahead of us and the new opportunities. We tried to figure out just how many times we'd climbed up those dreaded 118 stairs in the 2nd arrondissement, and we vowed never to live on the top floor of a walk-up again. At that precise moment, I got a text from James at the radio station. "Good news, mech! They've signed the lease on a new studio. We got it all to ourselves. We can record at any time of the day or night. It's a bright new future and a bright new studio. P.S. It's on the 6th floor with no elevator." Some things never change. "5.4. The resignation. It's a strange thing to be recognized by your voice. I'd been running the Eiffel Tower for 6 months, and I felt like I was onto something. People were writing in from around the world to say they were listening. Friends who'd gone beyond the stages of listening to support me surprised me by discussing recent episodes. The momentum was thrilling. One day, I was at Le Peloton Cafe in the Marais, and I was ordering drinks at the counter. As I headed out to a table on the terrace, a man stopped me in my tracks.
Oliver? Oliver G? Is that you?
He said with a start. He wasn't asking it, he was exclaiming it. He was almost jittery with excitement. "Yeah, that's me."
No way. Can't believe it. I thought I recognized your voice as you ordered the coffees.
Then he sang the jingle that I'd been using in the early episodes, composed on the spot by Slim and the Beast.
The Eiffel Tower with Oliver G.
He sang, turning back to his friends with his eyes wide.
That's the Aussie guy that does the podcast I was telling you about, remember?
The jingle bit was slightly embarrassing. More embarrassing was the fact that his friends apparently had no idea what he was talking about. They gave polite nods. I blushed and thanked him for listening, then headed to the outside terrace with our coffees. I was with Lena and a friend, and they thought it was a hoot. As we sat down, they were laughing and punching me in the arm. Fancy getting recognized by your voice, they said. But then it got weirder. Only 2 minutes had passed when an American woman came running down the street.
Oh my God, you're Oliver G. I can't believe it.
She'd recognized my face from a video I'd done and said she'd come to the cafe because I'd mentioned it on the show. In fact, she'd taken a lot of my recommendations, it turned out.
Oh my Lord, I love it, I love it. What a scream! And I've got to tell you, I've taken all your tips. I've done them all.
She said, reeling off the tours she'd taken, the restaurants she'd visited, and the books she'd bought, all based on the guests from my show.
Do you mind if I have a picture with you?
It was flattering to know that my work had such an effect on someone's holiday, but I also got a little niggling feeling of something else. What was it? Ah, that's it. Missed opportunity. That was the day that I realized there was a real potential in the show. That was the day it dawned on me that people were not just passively listening, they were actively listening. They were using the show for insights into Paris, and perhaps most importantly, they were spending money. Not on me, mind you. But surely there was a way I could twist this thing so I was getting a slice of the pie too. The almost tangible sense of opportunity was so strong that before I'd figured out how to monetize my show, I handed in my resignation at the news site. Now, let's be totally honest here. It wasn't just that sense of opportunity that made me quit the job. It was also time to go. You know when you're reading a book and your mind wanders elsewhere, then suddenly you snap back and wonder how much you missed? Well, that's a little how I felt with my job. And I couldn't figure out how long I'd been looking at the words without taking them in. It was time to snap out of it. I'd love to say that quitting my job was a brilliant move, and that from that moment on I became rich, but that's not true at all. It was a move that, practically at least, was quite stupid. Many French people told me afterwards that the trick is to negotiate when you quit, leave on good terms, and then you'll continue to earn a large portion of your salary from the state. It's called a rupture conventionnelle, in case you were ever planning to do the same thing. But I didn't do it. No, not me, not foolish old Oliver. I could sense the new energy in the Paris air, and I wanted to drink it, to breathe it in, to live it. Exactly how I'd make money from a podcast didn't enter my mind at all. I just knew I could do it. I was 30 years old, and I figured I was still young enough to struggle on a new project. I gave a month's notice to my editor, meaning my last day would be right after the French presidential election of 2017. After more than 2 years working as a full-time reporter in Paris, my stint with the news site was going to end with a big story. "5.5 Le Président de la République." After 5 years working at the news site, including 3 in Stockholm, but that's for another book, my time as a journalist was coming to an end. The French were deciding whether to vote in their youngest leader since Napoleon, Emmanuel Macron, or Marine Le Pen and the far right. The election was to be my last story for the news site, which seemed like a fitting bookend. In the lead-up, we reported the hell out of that election, and I'm glad to say that by now my French was much improved. I traveled around Paris and France and listened to anyone who'd talk. I spoke to young Parisians who were excited by the prospect of a president in his 30s. I went to a National Front rally in a former coal mining town, Hénin-Beaumont, where Marine Le Pen was a hero and people were hoping her anti-EU, anti-immigrant policies would turn their lives around. I even went to ghost towns in rural France where no one cared who'd win, and no one even cared to vote. In Roubaix, which was once the beating heart of the textile industry, people were so disenchanted with it all they didn't even want to talk to me about the election. The French papers called it the capital of abstention, after 45% of people didn't bother voting the last time around. It was fascinating to see how France could be so divided. Walking the streets of the towns in northern France made it evident, once again, that Paris wasn't France and France wasn't Paris. But no matter which way the vote went, France was going to get a change, which was clearly what everyone was after. On the night of the election, I was sent to the courtyard of the Louvre Museum, where Macron accepted his victory. He strode out to greet the crowds as the European anthem, Beethoven's Ode to Joy, blared from nearby speakers. He'd won in a landslide, 66% of the vote, and as I stood among the crowd of thousands, the result seemed to me like the exact kind of news that France needed. a fresh start, new ideas, and a pretty clear non merci to Marine Le Pen. I stumbled home that night exhausted, but relieved to have finished my work with the news site on a high after 2 years that included a lot of heavy reporting. But it felt like good news that night. The energy in the young crowd at the Louvre was exhilarating and contagious. They were excited for something new, and so was I. But my new chapter had nothing to do with Macron. I was going to tell my own story. I took a break after the election and spent some time setting up the Eiffel Tower to be its own entity as a podcast. I taught myself how to edit audio files so that I didn't need to rely on any outside help to produce the episodes. I built a website so I could see where the readers, and therefore the listeners, were. I joined a hosting platform to store all of the episodes and launch social media pages. All of these things I did organically, setting them up as I figured out that they were necessary. A long way down the road, I learned that many new podcasters get weighed down by being prepared for launch day, but it was never like that for me. When I realized I had an audience, I turned the radio show into a podcast. When I saw people wanted to follow me, I set up a Facebook page. When people started asking for details of the next episodes, I decided to release them every Monday. It was all quite natural. I didn't plan it. But now that I was going to try and make it as a podcaster, I realized I needed to take it pretty seriously. This was going to be a bumpy ride, and I needed to be ready for it. .6 The US. Quitting a full-time job is a life-changing moment and should be celebrated accordingly. At least that's what I think. A sensible person would knuckle down to find a new job. An even more sensible person would have a new job to seamlessly switch to, preferably with a higher salary. But someone like me thinks that quitting a job to pursue a podcast with no hint of an income should be celebrated. So with this in mind, I bought a pair of one-way tickets to New York as a surprise for Lena. We spent the next 6 weeks in a rental car, driving from New York to Los Angeles, from where we'd eventually fly back to Paris. We took the back roads, saw some of the most famous places in the entire world, and it was fantastic. Now, I'd love to get into all the details of this road trip, but I don't think I should because 1, this is meant to be a book about France, and 2, there's a full chapter about a French road trip coming up soon. But believe me, that American journey was beyond a highlight. I think a lot of people who take similar holidays probably take Route 66 or something similar and drive fairly directly between the two coasts, but not us. We first drove from New York to New Orleans, which whenever I tell Americans always prompts them to react the same way. You went that far down? We sure did, and it was crazier still. In case you know the United States well, here are the outliers on the map so you can connect the dots. New York, Atlanta, Memphis, New Orleans, Albuquerque, Kansas, yes, back through Texas, Las Vegas, San Francisco, then LA. If you mapped out our journey, it looks a lot less like a Route 66 cross-section and more like a monitor for an arrhythmic heart. But oh, how wonderful it was, especially the bits that were off the tourist trail. Sure, Nashville, the Grand Canyon, Hollywood, and Monument Valley are sublime, but I think my memories will always go back to the people. I'll remember the little basketball museum in rural Texas where I signed a ball for the owner, who thought I was a big-shot hooper from Australia. I'll remember being warned about returning to the town of Alligator, Mississippi, because folks go missing in Alligator, at least according to the woman at the catfish restaurant in the next town. I'll remember one of our hosts telling us he was an illegal drug dealer before taking us two-step dancing in a small town in the south. And I'll remember the high school principal in Nest City, Kansas, who wrote us into his weekly newsletter after we stopped by his school. We covered 7,000 miles in 6 weeks, and I had a newfound taste for big road trips. Luckily, Lena did too. That adventure was over far too quickly for my liking, and I returned to Paris broke, again, but refreshed and ready to make a serious effort at podcasting. It was the first time in 2.5 years that I was free in Paris. Remember, I didn't really know how Paris worked. Sure, I'd been free at the weekends and at the end of the work days, but what happens in the center of the city at 10 a.m. on a Tuesday? Are the bakeries busy on Thursday afternoons? Are waiters friendlier during off-peak hours? And how hard is it to get a seat on the terrace in the middle of the day? These were the questions I wanted to answer. Weekends in Paris are chaotic, and I now know they're not representative of the city in general. But weekends was all I'd had at this point, and I'd been dreading the thought of one day leaving Paris and realizing that I only knew daily life from the weekends. So, when we got back from the US and settled once more into Paris, I was giddy with excitement about exploring this second coming in the French capital.
And it's modern day Oliver G back in the room. And when I say that, I mean I'm recording this now. In fact, I'm recording this June 20th, 2021, this little outro, which you may have already realized is Father's Day in France and in America. My first Father's Day as a father feels kind of weird. And we're skipping way ahead of where we're up to in the book. Back onto the book in a second. But what a lovely Father's Day. Took little Otis for a long walk in the morning in one of those, I don't even know what you call it, baby holders. It's a baby Björn thing, you know, so the baby's wrapped up against your chest. Took him around for a walk along the Seine, through Invalides, down Rue Claire. Really lovely morning and a lovely day too. But that's another story. Back to chapter 5 of Paris on Air. It's a bit of a shorter chapter. It's right in the middle of the story and sort of setting things up for, you know, this podcast and how it's taken me all over France, really, and the doors that are open. But I just wanted to read a little bit of mail that came in this week and talk a little bit about some of the things in that chapter. That bit where I was recognized by my voice in the Peloton Cafe, that's a story I've told a lot over the years, and it really was a turning point for me. Because it was so abstract, so weird to get recognized by your voice, especially in Paris, you know. Nowadays, I mean, I get recognized for my face a lot in Paris. In fact, lately it's been happening every day. But the voice thing, that was such a trip, and it was really cool to have a sort of catalyst like that to jumpstart a career and to end another. But anyway, in this chapter, I really glossed over that American road trip. It was important for the story. It was sort of the bookend for closing the journalism job and starting up the new one. It was kind of like that last moment of freedom. I felt at the time it was maybe the last chance I'd ever have to take, like in my life, to take 6 weeks off in a row. So it was really this sort of, I was going to say Thelma and Louise moment, you know, just get out there and do it. But we were a lot safer than they were when we visited the Grand Canyon. Are you allowed to do spoilers 30 years after a movie comes out? I don't know. Anyway, for the Patreon supporters, I got way deeper into that American trip. Eddie and I put together a few beautiful pages with all the pictures from that road trip. And the reason we dug a bit deeper is I did the math. Out of the Patreon supporters, they're the people who are the members of the show and who make it exist. Over 80% of them put in an American address. So I figured we can get away with a bit of a deep dive. You'll see where we went. I'm sure, in fact, I'm certain that most of you Americans who look at some of those pictures will roll your eyes. I did some of my clothes shopping in Walmart, and I was quite proud. I thought it was funny to walk around with like a big, well, I'm not going to spoil it. Look at the pictures and you'll see. Also in the scroll, there's a lot more of Paris, a lot more behind-the-scene pictures, especially from the start of the podcast. There's pictures of where we used to live in the 11th, even inside that apartment. Some of the old tweets I had from when Macron won the presidency. There's a lot more. There's 12 pages of it, and I think you're going to love it. Patreon.com/The Earful Tower. In fact, it ends with a picture of me and Eddie in Hollywood. He was living there at the time, and now he's making scrolls for the Patreon members. So check that out. In other news, I figure because it's a shorter episode, I have time to read out a little bit of mail. Here's one that came in from Sean Kennedy.
He says, Oliver, I hit you up the other day on Instagram with a tattoo question. He certainly did, asking about tattoo parlors in Paris. I got no idea, which I said. And he said, thanks for the amazing content. On my way home from work today, I listened to the Tracing the Philippe Auguste Wall episode on Apple Podcasts, and it sealed the deal. I absolutely had to become a Patreon supporter. I love your passion for the historical side of Paris, all the interesting places to visit in the city, and the amazing guests you have on the show. It shows a unique perspective that I haven't found on other podcasts. I'm so thankful to have the opportunity to support your work. Netflix is out. Whoa, whoa, whoa. Netflix is out and you are in. From Sean. This is huge pressure. You know, when I think about those kind of messages, which is very lovely to hear, Sean, thank you, there is, one thing that I can offer that Netflix can't. Can you hear the baby crying in the background? Goodness me, Father's Day, huh? Thanks, later. Yeah, when I think about the difference between this and Netflix, because there is a similarity, you pay for a monthly content, get all the bonuses. The difference is that this one comes with a community of like-minded Francophiles and the chance to influence the work that I do. Like me and Sean were back and forthing after that message to talk about his trip to Paris and how he's going to try and stay on a houseboat and how it gave me an idea for a podcast episode. You're not going to get that with Netflix, folks. Check it out, patreon.com/The Earful Tower. Thanks for joining, Sean. And I'm glad you enjoyed the Philippe Auguste episode. Weirdly, I went back and listened to it after he said that. And it was a really fun episode. If you're new around here and you've listened this far, go and check that one out. Eddie did some great editing with the music. Now I'm going to finish on this. I got a package sent to the P.O. box the other day, and I know a lot of you have emailed me asking where to send something potentially. I'm assuming like gifts for the baby. And I've almost always said, what a lovely gesture. But, you do enough as listeners to this show. You absolutely don't need to send things in. It's such a lovely thought, but you really don't need to do it. The thought is worth so much to me, and just the fact that you're here listening to the show means so much to me. You absolutely don't need to send anything in. So I pretty much always say that to people, but it is possible to track down the P.O. box where to send things. It's not a secret. You can find it if you really want to. And that's obviously what Andrea Schmidt did from Germany. And she sent such a lovely gift. It was so, thought out. And there have been others who've sent in lovely gifts, which we're so thankful for. You guys are beyond kind. But this one was really touching. It was a book, and with it was a letter explaining it on red paper that I'm going to read to you, most of it anyway. Dear Lena, dear Oliver, and dear little Otis. Here's a little explanation concerning the present. I thought you might get a lot of presents from all over the world, so I tried to find something special from where I live. And the book was The Town Musicians of Bremen by Gerda Müller. The Town Musicians of Bremen. I'm not very good at a German accent, but I tried. And Andrea says, this story of this fairy tale takes place in the woods around my hometown. I often walk the dog or ride the horse on the paths where it's believed the town musicians walked. Bremen is also nearby, although they never made it up to there. Enclosed was a card, and she explains that the painting on the card is from one of her favorite German painters, Paula Maudischenbecker, who also lived near Bremen. And around 1900, she went a few times to Paris for inspiration and followed her best friend Clara Westhoff, who studied sculpture at the Institut Rodin. And she continues a little bit about that. And then at the end of the letter, she goes, so there you have it. I love it when you say this sentence on the podcast. All the small connections, and there are lots more, that causes my love and interest for Paris and France. Imagine how happy I was finding your podcast and also being a Patreon supporter. I hope you like the book, and I wish your little family happy days and quiet nights. I'm looking forward to some walk shows with the stroller. Lovely greetings from Germany, Andrea. Now, Andrea, that was so touching. Thank you so much for the letter and the card and the beautifully illustrated book, which I can't wait to read to Otis. Thank you very much. Maybe I should say Dankeschön for the lovely book, and for everybody else for your cards, emails, and letters. This has been an incredible break that I've been having from putting out the regular content, and I'm so grateful that you guys have hung around and been there for me in this time. And as you can count on, you know I'm going to be there for you to give you an escape to Paris, an entertaining escape to Paris in the weeks to come. But that'll do for this week. If you've enjoyed it, as I've said before, you can get the full audio experience. Just go to the earfultower.com/shop, and we've got paperbacks of the book as well, ebook versions. You can get the full copy. Otherwise, become a Patreon supporter, patreon.com/The Earful Tower. That's it for me. Merci beaucoup. Thanks very much for being here. Next week, chapter 6, things really get going in the book at that point. We've got crocodiles, we've got cheese tasting, we've got the story of when I first came to Paris, finding Mary, and we got a lot more than that. I'm excited for you to hear it. I hope you are too. I'll talk to you soon. Merci beaucoup. Au revoir tout le monde.